All right. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. I hope this is recording properly. So I have three different screens going. And I got notes everywhere. So I have my slides in front of me here with all which have notes, and then I also have kind of talking points here. So if you see me looking around, that's what I'm doing. I'm not probably looks a little weird to you. Okay, so this slideshow goes through chapters 1 and 2, but I'm only going to be lecturing on chapter 1 today, or what they're calling part 1. I also want you to read the introduction to the book that is written by the editors of the book, which I'm not specifically going to be lecturing on, but it's helpful, kind of sets the stage for the textbook. So, welcome. Here we are, International Sign Language and Visual Gestural Systems. And we're going to be talking a little bit about, there's going to be a lot of kind of leading up to the conversation as we go through all of the slides. So before we talk about International Sign Language, I want to talk briefly about expectations, because many people, I'm going to move my talking points over here because I look like I'm staring off into space. Many people will come to a class like this with assumptions that we need to unpack right away. And so some of you may be here because you may have seen International Sign Language used at a conference, or maybe you've seen it online. And some of you may have seen it interpreted before, or maybe you've actually even interpreted it yourself before. I'm guessing there's not a whole lot of you who have. And some of you are just here because you have to, or because it sounds exciting. So what we're not going to do in this course, it's not about learning a list of international signs or becoming fluent in international sign, because that's not going to be possible by the end of the 7 weeks. And the editors Rosenstock and Napier are very clear about that it's that even the purpose of the book is just to have a better understanding of what IS is. It's not about you developing that fluency. If it's something that you do want to develop, then you need a mentor that uses international sign, or maybe do an internship and develop it in some way. But what this course is really geared towards is about having a better understanding that international sign of what it is as a practice. Why are we using it? Something that people do when they come together across linguistic boundaries. And we're going to be looking at how international sign works, who uses it, who has access to it, and also very important, who does not. And we're going to be looking at the power, the ideology, and the inequality, because language is never neutral. And so throughout this course, I want you to hold on to one core idea. International sign exists because deaf people adapt, not because a perfect system was designed, and not because everyone magically understands each other, but because communication matters and people are willing to work for it. So, moving on to the core of chapter 1. So chapter 1 of Rosenstock and Napier's book is foundational. If you misunderstand this chapter, then everything else is going to become very confusing. So today we're going to really slow down. We're going to really sit with the author's core argument. And I focus very much on this first chapter on just talking about the basics. So it's going to sound like we're really hammering home repeatedly a basic definition of what is IS, but it's important. So again, this course is not about memorizing signs or becoming fluent in international sign, as I said, but we're going to be looking at, how does this play out? How did it come to be? So, international sign only exists because of people, interaction, and what their needs. But to some extent, that's true for ASL too. It emerged out of need. We're also going to question some very deeply held assumptions, especially hearing-centered ideas about universality, language purity, and what counts as a real language. International sign, as Rosenstock and Napier describe it, is not a language in the traditional sense. It has no native speakers, no fixed grammar, and no standardized lexicon. Instead, it's a contact signing system that emerges when deaf people do not share a common sign language. It relies heavily on iconicity, spatial mapping, gesture, and constant negotiation. And what's important here is that IS is highly, highly adaptive. It changes depending on who's signing, where they are, and what they're trying to accomplish. Sorry, I got screens that are competing. So again, if you're taking notes, and you should be, there are some things that they agree on, which is that International Sign has no native speakers, no fixed grammar, and no standardized lexicon. I'm sorry. My screens are just, I'm trying to figure out how to get everything to live on my screens and be. And they're like overlapping. Okay. Okay. Course framing. And every time I do this, I'm losing my notes. I guess I am going to have to go back to the other screen. They keep disappearing on me. All right. So one of the most important points in chapter 1 is the idea that an international sign should be understood as a practice, not a product. So in other words, product meaning the language itself, it's a thing. It's a practice, which means it's a little bit loosey-goosey, and it's not a bunch of hard and fast rules. Focuses on interaction, not memorization, and it's a deaf-centered perspective. This is a big shift, especially if you've been trained to think of languages as things that you can package, teach, and test. A product is something that's fixed, and a practice is something that you do. And IS only exists when people are actively engaging with one another. There's no pure international sign language that exists outside of interaction. So with ASL, which has very finite and distinct rules of grammar and language, ASL exists unto itself. The rules exist from you and from me. You can sit and you can use ASL even if you're sitting by yourself in a room. You can't do that with international sign language because the interaction is the crux of the practice itself. This is why the authors really do resist defining IS too rigidly, because the moment that you freeze it or put too many rules on it is the moment that you misunderstand it. And it takes a minute to wrap your head around what international sign is, which is why we're focusing so much on these definitions. This course treats international sign as something that people do rather than something that they memorize, and emphasize that IS emerges through interaction and visual negotiation, and that we will challenge hearing-centric ideas about language. I know I'm sounding repetitive, so what I'm reading here are my notes that are actually included with the slides. So if you want to download the slides, those are also included in the discussion forum. And so you'll have kind of like a brief summary of what of my lecture today. In addition to the slides, you'll have my notes. So again, defining IS, contact signing system emerges when no shared sign language exists, negotiated, fluid, and context specific. And what's important here is that IS is highly adaptive, as I said, and it changes depending on who's signing, where they are, and what they're trying to accomplish. Unlike ASL, which there's some of that, but language is still language, whereas in IS, that's not the case. So we've talked a little bit about what it is. Let's talk about what it's not. One of the biggest myths that we have to let go of immediately is the idea that international sign is a universal sign language. And I think when you hear the term international sign, you're like, oh, well, it's a universal language that everyone can understand. But that's not true, not even a little bit. The idea is incredibly persistent, especially among hearing people, but that's completely wrong. IS is also not neutral, it's not culture free, and it's not equally accessible to everyone. So even highly iconic signs are shaped by culture and experience. So when we talk about IS, we also have to talk about power and culture and influence and all of that good stuff. So let's talk about some of these other myths, or the myth of universal sign language. So a lot of people, and it makes sense too, because if you think about, well, if signs are visual and they're iconic, which a lot of times they are, then they have to be universally understood. But Napier and Rosenstock and Napier are very clear that this is false. Iconicity does not equal universality. A sign that seems obvious to one person may be confusing or meaningless to another. So you think about cultural nuances or how we make certain signs. We might see a certain motion or whatever and associate it with, say, a greeting, and then we'll know that that means a certain thing, or we could infer that it means a certain thing. But if we're in a different country that has a different culture and different cultural standards that doesn't have that motion or that gesture, then that sign is not iconic anymore. It's become meaningless. And so, for example, what seems like a natural way to show an object or an action depends on how you've been taught to represent the world visually. The world visually, sorry. So why does this myth still continue, even though it's very straightforward and multiple researchers besides just these authors have made it very clear that this is not the case? Well, the authors suggest several reasons why this myth of the universality still continues to persist. One is hearing-centric views of language. So a lot of this is stigma and misunderstandings that have continually been perpetuated by hearing individuals who don't understand. Oversimplification of signed languages. So a lot of people, I'm sure you've run across plenty of people who don't understand ASL, or I wish I had $1 for every time someone who is a non-user of ASL has said something along the lines to me like, oh, I learned ASL. And then I get all excited and I start to talk to them and they say, oh, no. Well, I know how to do this. And they'll start fingerspelling to me. Well, fingerspelling is not ASL, as we all know, and that is not the entire language. It's just one little teeny bit. But people who have had any touch point with ASL, they feel like that is the language, and there's a lot of misunderstanding. So, and this is no different. So all of those misunderstandings that play into other signed languages, including ASL, filter into this as well. And of course, lastly, the authors also talk about the fact that media portrayals often flatten deaf communication. So we know that in the media, people's perceptions of deaf and hard of hearing has been somewhat stunted. Sometimes it's over dramatized and it's very limited. They don't understand that deafness is truly a spectrum. And then there's also a deeper issue here, which is the myth of universality makes people comfortable. It removes responsibility, because if you say it's universal and it's for everyone, well, that's nice and tidy and wraps it up with a little bow. But that's not the case. If language is universal, then misunderstanding is no one's fault. But if language requires negotiation, then understanding becomes a shared responsibility. And some people are not willing to accept or want that responsibility. So I realize now that I'm going through this that my slides are not always in order. We're going to be jumping around, so just go with me. A second where I want to talk about iconicity, which is helpful, but not magical. So chapter 1 spends a lot of time unpacking the role of iconicity in international sign, which absolutely helps. And we know that iconicity plays a huge role in ASL. Think about any handful of signs and how they're how that word or what that concept that is represented. Coffee, what does that come from? Well, for some people who have never ground their own coffee beans, maybe the sign for coffee doesn't make any sense to them. Tea, of dipping the tea bag. Just about, there's so many signs that there has some sort of reference to the concept along the way. But if you're in a place that has never ground coffee beans or doesn't use tea or have never experienced that, this sign is completely meaningless and useless. Not that it can't be remembered, but it doesn't have any association. But iconicity does not eliminate misunderstanding. Two people may use highly iconic strategies and still fail to understand each other because they're drawing on different cultural assumptions, as I mentioned. And this is why skilled IS users constantly have to monitor their audience. They don't assume understanding, they check for it. The other thing you have to understand is that IS is heavily based on gesture, which is true with all signed languages, but particularly with IS, there's a whole nother level of that where there's a lot of gesture and mime at levels that you won't see in other signed languages where there's a very firm language structure. All right, we're going to get to that in a second, but I want to talk about international assign and talk about that negotiation that I just mentioned. So one of the most important ideas in the chapter is negotiation. And IS is not about transmitting meaning perfectly the first time. It's about adjusting, repairing, and reworking meaning together. This might look like repeating an idea in a different way, switching strategies, using more gesture, slowing down, checking comprehension. Understanding is built collaboratively and shared responsibility. This is fundamentally different from how we often think about language, especially in academic settings where correctness is emphasized over connection. Think about, I'll even use myself as an example. As your professor, I'm delivering the content to you in academic English. It would make, I have certain assumptions at this point. You're a college student, so I know that you're here because you applied to the program, you demonstrated a certain level of ability just to even be here. So I'm not actually taking additional responsibility to communicate my teaching. And this sounds rude because I don't mean it the way that I'm quite saying it, in that it's not a shared responsibility, because I think there is some shared, it's my responsibility to teach and it's your responsibility to learn. But in terms of my lecturing and our communication, there's a higher responsibility and expectation that you're going to rise to the level of the content that I'm giving to you and that you're going to understand it. I'm not doing quite as much slowing down and stopping to use gesture. I'm not communicating it in 5 different ways and constantly probing to find out whether or not you understand what I'm doing and where I'm going. And there's not quite as much of that give and take. Just because there's certain rules with our language, and I know that you know what those are. So because the rules of language, whether I deliver in ASL or I choose to use spoken English, the rules of the languages are finite, and you know what they are for the most part. There might be a word here or there that you might be like, oh, I have to look that up. She used a word that I'm not familiar with, and that's okay. But the actual language itself is already familiar to you and known to you. So I don't have to backtrack and say, well, do you understand what I was doing when I did this? Or do you understand what I'm saying when I say this? Because I chose to convey it in a different way. And I also don't necessarily have to consider how the signs are going to come across to you based on your cultural framework, because the signs are the signs. If I use coffee and tea means coffee and tea, and you've already learned those, and I know that you know those signs and what their conceptual meaning is. So again, this one's a little bit different. In chapter 1, Rosenstock and Napier hint at something that we're going to talk about further along in the book, but they do mention it, so I think it's important to at least mention it here, which is the concept of power. Not everyone has equal access to international sign spaces. So people who travel internationally, attend conferences, work in advocacy or professional roles are more likely to develop comfort with international sign. And this means that IS is not neutral, because someone who doesn't have access to those things isn't going to have the same level of comfort. Who gets understood more easily is often linked to whose signing style is already familiar in international spaces. And this is something that we're going to examine much more deeply later on in the course, but it's important to plant the seed now because they do mention it. So before we go on to today's discussion prompt, I want to close the lecture by returning to the core idea, which is that international sign exists because people care about being understood. However, it's important to note that it is imperfect, it is not equal, and it is constantly changing. But it's also a powerful example of human adaptability, creativity, and willingness to negotiate meaning. So as you continue reading in the book, I want you to resist the urge to ask, is international sign language a real language? But instead, I want you to ask these questions. Who is using it? In what context are they using it? With what goals? Why are they using it? And at what cost? These questions will serve you far better in this course and beyond it. For your discussion prompt today, so I want you to read this and I want you to respond in the discussion forums. And how you're going to be doing that is you can do 2 separate paragraphs, or you can answer this as one long response, but I want you to cover and very specifically answer both questions. So you'll be graded on both, 10 points apiece, and as well as responding to each other's posts. I want you to draw on your own opinion, your own experiences, as well as whatever you've read in the book, or maybe whatever I've mentioned here, and maybe you can expand upon it. Again, we're just setting the stage for the first lecture. And I want you to respond in the form, who benefits from the myth of universality? We talked a little bit briefly about what that means and why it's a myth, but who benefits from that? And I want you to go a little bit deeper than what I just said a couple minutes ago, because I know what I said, but I want you to take it further. And how does this myth erase deaf culture? So I want you to think about taking it a step further. How does this impact deaf culture or deaf cultures? If you have any knowledge or experience of different deaf cultures in, say, different international cultures and how those are impacted, you can do like a comparison kind of thing to kind of highlight where you're going. But again, speak to your own experiences and what you know, as well as what you're drawing from the book, what you've gleaned so far from the chapter. And I look forward to having a great discussion with you all. We'll be using the same slide deck for week 2, where we're going to be talking about the next chapter, but I just compiled everything into one slide deck. So I'm going to pick up on slide 11 next week. So if you've already downloaded this, you don't need to download it again. It will be there for you. I tried to slow it down and be as specific as possible. However, if you feel that you need, you still have questions, or you have some anything that you need to clarify, I'm going to do my best, especially this week, to jump into the discussion forum and weigh in and give you my thoughts. But please don't hesitate to email me and let me know. And I'll be happy to answer it for you. All right. Hope you're having a great week and off to a great start. Take care. Bye.